Pamela Mitford is the least well known of the famed Mitford sisters, who gained prominence for their stylish and controversial lives during the mid-20th century. Pamela has been called the forgotten sister and the other one, and led a very secretive life. But why? Join me as we explore her story. Pamela Mitford was born on the 25th of November 1907 in Wilbury, Wiltshire in southwest England. Pamela was her parents' second child, as Nancy, another daughter, had been born 3 years earlier. Her family were well-established members of minor nobility in northern England who could trace its heritage back centuries in England. Her father was David Freeman Mitford, 2nd Baron Ruysdael, while her mother was Sydney Bowles, a daughter of an MP and prominent publishing magnate. She would eventually have 5 sisters and 1 brother, Tom arriving 2 years after Pamela in 1909, and Diana, Unity, Jessica and Deborah following in 1910, 1914, 1917 and 1920. The Mitfords had a peculiar childhood, raised by extremely eccentric parents and homeschooled for the most part. Unlike many of her siblings, Pamela never developed a great taste for city life, and even in her childhood she loved the animals on the Mitford country estate. This was a passion which would define much of her adult life. Yet, there were also troublesome aspects to her youth. She and her sisters were strong-willed and highly opinionated on all matter of things. As they grew up, a considerable rivalry developed between them. Nancy, in particular, teased her younger sister remorselessly, but as they grew older, she and Nancy remained closer, whereas the sisters' relationship with the middle sisters Diana and Unity, and with Tom, would become strained by their politics. Pamela's love of the outdoors, animals and horse riding developed despite physical limitations which plagued her in her youth. She suffered from polio, which had left her partially lame in one leg, but she managed to overcome this and led a life which was largely unaffected by it, though the condition did hamper her movements in old age. As Pamela grew up, her interest in all things rural, from gardening to cooking with foraged ingredients, became even stronger. Her affection for animals was also notable and would characterise much of her life. She spent time in London amongst the high society of the bright young things, with which her older sister Nancy and her younger sister Diana were associated, but her heart remained in the countryside. The poet John Betjeman, whom Pamela knew in the 1920s and 1930s, and who was clearly besotted by her for a time, described her in an unpublished poem of his entitled The Mitford Sisters as, quote, "Miss Pamela, most rural of them all, on account of her love of farm animals and a preference for living a quiet life in the countryside, tending gardens and looking after horses, ponies and dogs." The early 1930s were peculiar years for a young woman who was interested in the simple things in life. The Mitford family politics were deeply divided at this time. The sisters' mother leaned toward fascism, which was spreading across continental Europe at an alarming speed during these years. Sydney's political views rubbed off on 2 of her daughters, Diana and Unity, and her and David's only son, Tom. And these political views became political ties from 1932 onwards, when Diana first became the mistress of Oswald Mosley, the leader of the British Union of Fascists, and then his wife. These ties ensured that the Mitfords spent time in Germany with senior members of the Nazi regime, where Diana's marriage to Mosley took place in 1936. Yet Pamela seems to never have backed any of Diana, Unity and Tom's political views. Instead, when she and her mother met Adolf Hitler in the mid-1930s, Pamela exchanged recipes for wholemeal bread with the Nazi leader, and her primary interest lay in the baby potatoes which were served at lunch. Such practicalities were typical of Pamela's personality. Her sisters, who called her woman, relied on her for practical advice, and it was noted that, quote, "Pam was often right, but seldom listened to." In times of adversity throughout their lives, many of her siblings turned to her as a rock of stability. In the mid-1930s, Pamela began a relationship with Derek Jackson. They bonded over a shared love of equestrian activities, Jackson being a noted jockey, riding in the Grand National at Aintree in 1935. He hailed from a wealthy Welsh family, his father, Sir Charles Jackson, having been a chairman of the News of the World, but Jackson was independently successful himself, having emerged as one of Britain's leading atomic physicists in the 1930s, and acquiring a position at Oxford University. Pamela and Derek's relationship has long been understood to have been one of convenience. Derek was bisexual, while Pamela was almost certainly a lesbian, but since she was so private about her personal life, there is little concrete evidence to confirm this. They married in 1936, and whatever their relationship might have been in private, it is clear that they were close to one another. Yet, they did not have children, and Pamela would never become a mother, despite her sister Jessica once noting that she would have made an ideal parent. When the Second World War broke out in the autumn of 1939, Derek was called away often from their farm in Berkshire. His abilities as a physicist made him valuable to the government, and he spent much of the early years of the war helping to improve the Royal Air Force's air defence system and radars. Consequently, he flew more than 1,000 hours as a navigator during the conflict. In stark contrast to Pamela's husband's wartime service, in the summer of 1940, her sister Diana and Oswald Mosley were arrested on account of their ties to Nazi Germany. The Nazis had just conquered France, and with the Blitz of Britain beginning in an effort to bomb or starve Britain into surrendering, Nazi sympathisers like the Mosleys were arrested as a potential fifth column in the country, who would feed information to Berlin and possibly work to undermine the British war effort from within. Thus, Diana would remain under arrest until November 1943. The upshot of this was that two of her children, Alexander and Desmond, were taken in by Pamela and Derek at Rignall House, their country farm in Berkshire. Despite her sister's political affiliations, Pamela wrote regularly to Diana at Holloway Prison and never disowned her, in contrast to the eldest of the Mitfords, Nancy, who denounced Diana as, quote, sinister woman. Eventually, as the defeat of Nazi Germany became inevitable in the course of 1943, the Mosleys were released from prison and allowed to remain under house arrest, at which time Alexander and Desmond left Pamela and Derek's home. In the aftermath of the Second World War, Derek left his academic position and they relocated to Ireland to live at Tullymaine Castle near Fairford in County Tipperary in the Irish Midlands. Built in the early 19th century, the castle was the centrepiece of a stud farm, and Pamela was in her element here, with her love for all things rural, as was Derek, owing to the fact that a major hunting meet was held here. Their decision to relocate to Ireland was largely owing to a desire to avoid high post-war taxes which were being imposed on the landed gentry in Britain in the aftermath of the war to pay for the enormously expensive conflict. At Tullymaine, Pamela was not entirely shut off from her remaining sisters. Deborah had married Andrew Cavendish, a son of the 10th Duke of Devonshire in 1941, and a few years later, he had become the heir to the Cavendish estate, which included Lismore Castle in County Waterford in Ireland, not far to the south of Tullymaine. Thus, in the spring and early summer, Deborah would visit Ireland, while guests at Tullymaine also included her elder sister Nancy and her lifelong literary friend Evelyn Waugh, author of Brideshead Revisited, whom Pamela also knew from the social circles they had moved in London during the 1920s and 1930s. A perhaps less welcoming addition to the Mitford presence in Ireland was the arrival of Pamela's younger sister Diana in 1951, with her husband Oswald Mosley, after they purchased a house in Galway. The Mosleys had become social exiles in post-war Britain, and had decided to leave the country. Pamela and Derek's early years at Tullymaine were happy ones, but while she was content to remain in the Irish countryside with her horses, dogs and vegetable gardens, Derek eventually grew restless and wanted to return to the lab. He began spending more and more time away in England, and this, combined with their complicated sexualities, led to them divorcing in 1950. The split was formalised the following year. They sold Tullymaine Castle, and Derek headed to take up a position at the National Centre for Scientific Research in Paris, but Pamela worked out an arrangement whereby she continued to rent Tullymaine from the buyer even after they had sold it. She stayed there until 1958. During the years that Pamela and Derek had lived together at Tullymaine, a friend of theirs, an Italian horse rider and trainer by the name of Giuditta Tomasini, had been a frequent visitor there. She continued to call regularly throughout the 1950s after Derek and Pamela separated, and she and Pamela became companions, though the exact nature of their relationship from a sexual standpoint remains somewhat unclear. In 1958, when she elected to leave Tullymaine, Pamela relocated to Switzerland to live with Tommasini. Evidently, there was little disguising their relationship at this point, as Pamela's sister Jessica said she'd become a you-know-what-bian, and referred to Tommasini as Pamela's, quote, German wife, though why she described the Italian woman as German remains something of a mystery. Pamela and she were evidently happy here for many years, and she lived in Switzerland throughout most of the 1960s. Eventually, they decided to part ways, but Pamela did not leave Switzerland until her dogs, many of which were old at the time, had died, as she was unwilling to force them to relocate to England in their old age. It was an indication of where her priorities lay throughout her life. When she eventually did leave Switzerland in 1972, it was to live in the rural Cotswolds in Gloucestershire. Her return to England brought her the distinction of being the woman who introduced the Appenzeller Spitz Holbein breed of chicken to Britain from Switzerland. Pamela's old age was spent in rural England with her animals and garden, yet it was not an entirely quiet and solitary life. She visited Ireland on occasion when Deborah was at Lismore, and despite the family's very differing politics, she spent some winters in South Africa with Diana, where the Moses' political views did not make them persona non grata of the Afrikaner community in the context of apartheid. In the 1980s, she belatedly had a brief television career. In 1980, she appeared in a documentary entitled Nancy Mitford, a portrait by her sisters, in which she offered numerous recollections of her older sister while sitting by the River Windrush in Gloucestershire and posing by her ponies on her farm. 4 years later, she was invited on a chat show to discuss chickens, a performance which was evidently noteworthy enough for Deborah to ironically state that Pamela should have her own chat show, exclusively on the subject of poultry. Pamela was staying with a friend in London in the early 1990s when she fell down a flight of stairs and broke 2 bones in the leg which had been weak throughout her life on account of her childhood polio. She had surgery but never fully recovered, and died in hospital on the 12th of April 1994 at the age of 86. True to her equine passions throughout her life, with her last words she is believed to have inquired what horse had won the Grand National at Aintree 3 days earlier. Thank you everyone for watching this video on Pamela Mitford. I hope you found it interesting. Let me know what you thought of her life down below in the comments, and if you have any other suggestions, be sure to leave them down below in the comments. I hope you guys are subscribed and the notifications turned on to get all my videos as soon as I upload them. Anyway, that's all from me, so I'll see all of you in the next Forgotten Life. Thanks.